from the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. Glad you are with us tonight. We are tackling a big topic, but one that's definitely worth talking about, one we haven't been able to talk about in a while with COVID, and I'm glad we're getting back on it. We're talking about climate change. President Biden has instituted several changes in policy, and so what does that look like? What does that mean, and how do we deal with the polarization that we see when this topic is sometimes discussed? So plenty to talk about. Very happy to have with us Michael P. Vandenbergh. He's the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair in Law, Director of the Climate Change Research Network. He's joining us via Zoom. That is, what is that behind you? That is a picture of a
dining hall at Vanderbilt.
The dining hall, a dining hall at Vanderbilt. Well, great. Well, thank you for being here.
Very excited to be here.
All right, so we're seeing these major proposals, I guess, from President Biden. What, I guess, how would you, first of all, how would you characterize those? I've just characterized them as major. Would you say they're major? And what impact will they have on our lives here, kind of in the short term and then possibly long term?
Great questions. So first, they were very on the ball with the presidential transition. So they came out the day the president was inaugurated and issued executive orders and made appointments. And so they were very on the ball. What did they do? Just recently, probably the biggest thing is a commitment to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. So that's a commitment in the Paris Agreement process. And the rest of the federal government commitments essentially organize themselves around that idea. So that's kind of a target that we can all see the federal government shooting at. Other things that they did were to announce a goal of 100% clean electricity by 2035, and a net zero economy by 2050, and then to use federal procurement to get there. That's something that we'll see happening right away, to reverse a number of the regulations that had been adopted during the Trump administration promoting fossil fuels and instead shift over toward trying to promote renewables and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so those are some of the key things. Now, let me just say one other thing as well. I'm also on the board, and the mayor just recently appointed me to the board of the Nashville Electric Service. So in addition to being a professor of law, I'm serving there. But my comments here are based on my own personal views, not something based on the NES.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad you said that. And all right, the things you said are important, and they can almost seem overwhelming. And I want to try and drill down into each of them, or at least a couple of them. A goal to reach 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. So what does that mean? How do we do that?
So we're already seeing a transition in that direction. And what this really does is it gives us, again, a target like that national goal. So what does that mean to start off with? Notice that they talked about clean energy or carbon-free energy. And what that means is they allowed nuclear power to be included in that. And so in the Tennessee Valley, that's an important thing for us because nuclear power produces a lot of our electricity. Hydropower will count as well. And again, you see a lot of hydropower here in Tennessee. In addition, now what we're going to be seeing is a much more solar power and wind power. And some of that will come from government regulations. But what's interesting, I believe, is that a substantial amount of the low carbon energy between now and 2035 is going to come from companies who've made commitments to renewable power. Over 300 of the largest companies in the U.S. have committed to 100% renewable power. So when a Google or a Facebook comes into the Tennessee Valley, whatever it is that TVA or the state might want to say about low carbon power, these companies are saying, if you want our data center, if you want our new facilities, you want our jobs, you've got to give us low carbon power. So I think that's a lot of the driver in combination with what you're seeing from the Biden administration.
So we have President Biden come in, and here's this goal by 2035. There's another goal by 2030 that you mentioned at the top of the show.
That's right.
To achieve a reduction from 2005 levels in greenhouse gas pollution. So reduce greenhouse gas pollution by 50% by 2030.
That's right.
And so, all right, I wonder, we have a new president come in, and he makes these goals that are outside of the time that he's going to be in office. And what happens if things change? What happens if another party comes in and everything changes? How derailed would these be, I guess?
And I think that's a place that the U.S. is in right now that's very different from where we were 20 or 30 years ago. I think it's quite likely that we'll see a swinging pendulum of party control, Republicans and Democrats in the House, maybe in the Senate, possibly the White House. We don't know. And so I think your question is right on point for anyone who's wondering where we're going from a climate perspective. But what's different today is that you're seeing, again, companies, investors, insurance companies, lenders, local governments, roughly half the states, are all pushing in the same direction. So the difference now is that the federal government is leading right now, but even if it gets totally out of the game, what we're going to see is continued progress in this direction. For example, the Trump administration pushed hard to promote fossil fuels and to reduce the extent to which we were decarbonizing the economy. But the U.S. economy still decarbonized over that time. And we saw the first reduction in per capita household electricity use since the Second World War during that period. And all of that was likely because of the uptake of LED light bulbs and more efficient equipment, and that then reduces our carbon footprint. So there are factors driving the global and local and regional economies that are bigger than what government is doing. I think government can play a role in encouraging or trying to slow down those changes, but the changes are so big right now that it's like a rolling boulder that you don't want to get in front of if you're at the bottom of the hill.
I'm encouraged when you say that the businesses, corporations, industry is kind of embracing this, and that's moving things along. But again, I hear this goal to reach 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. Is that a painful scenario?
Good question. And I think it will depend a great deal from grid to grid around the country. And as I've looked at TVA's commitments, I don't see them committing to reach that goal to 2035, 100% clean energy. They're pushing in the right direction. And I think they're getting pushed a little bit harder, again, by their large corporate customers, universities, cities within the service area and things like that. So will it be expensive or not? Well, right now, the cheapest form of power in the United States is solar power. And so what we're seeing is there are issues about, you can't get solar power at nighttime, so you need to run other sources. So we have to deal with those kinds of, they're called intermittency issues, that some types of power, you don't get wind power when the wind doesn't blow, for example. But you can combine lots of these renewable sources with other forms of power that don't have this intermittency issue, and you can get to something very close to that clean energy goal by 2035 without it costing a great deal more. The cost of solar power has gone down dramatically in the last decade alone, just for example. And we can bring in power like wind power as well. And so the pain here can be quite light. And we have to remember that it has to get offset against the pain of not meeting this goal. We tend to focus on the pain of the thing in front of us. But the big pain here is if we go business as usual, we ignore these standards, and then we offload into our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren the cost of having ignored the problem in the meantime. So I would say there's one other just really important factor here. I was with a group that helped fund a study last year that compared the carbon intensity of the electric grid in our area to the carbon intensity of the grid in 6 competing cities around the country: Austin, Charlotte, Raleigh, cities like that. And we're competing with those cities for businesses and jobs. And so those grids, for the most part, are decarbonizing faster than we are. And what that means is that if there are businesses out there, and there are hundreds of them, and many of them the kind of businesses we want to attract, we have to be thinking carefully about whether we want our grid to be less decarbonized than some of the ones in the cities we compete with, if we really want to get the kind of best jobs and businesses that we can get. So there's pain on both sides of the ledger, I guess, or good things on both sides of the ledger, depending on how you want to think about it. Okay,
absolutely. And one of the overarching goals here is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. Is that right? Are we actually targeting the amount that we're talking about, the world warming? Is that 1.5
Yes.
degrees Celsius? Is that right?
That's an aspiration. I think that's going to be very difficult to reach. There was just a study that suggested there is a very good chance that we will cross that threshold at least once in the next 4 years. Others are shooting for a 2 degrees Celsius goal. And it's very hard to know exactly what target we can meet. Reaching 1.5 would not avoid climate change, but it might avoid some of the worst problems of climate change, and it might avoid us crossing some tipping points where we can't catch up, we can't go back. So there's a real value in trying to keep temperatures at 1.5. I think that's going to be really hard to do. More likely, we might keep things between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, increase over pre-industrial levels. Even with that, we're going to see very substantial changes. Feet level rises in the sea, increased heat waves in the summertime, migration of people away from the coast and away from areas that are too hot, changes in agricultural production that can be really disruptive. So we're going to see those changes no matter what. But that is the target people are shooting for, 1.5 on the more aggressive end, 2 degrees Celsius if they think we can't meet 1.5, and trying to get at least as close as possible is the way to reduce the economic and social and human health harms of climate change over the long run.
So obviously there's some people who question this. We have a divided country. We'll talk about that in a moment.
Sure.
But then there are others that I think fully believe in the science, but they may question, can we really stop this? Is it now at a point, you mentioned a tipping point, are we already getting past a tipping point? And so you study this and
Right.
tell us, give us hope, or give us the facts. I mean, what about that?
Right. So I'm a law professor, so I'm not going to opine directly on the science, but I work closely with people who understand the climate science very well. And what they tell me is that we haven't crossed, as far as we know, any tipping points that make where we are irretrievable. We're not in a runaway climate change kind of situation. So there is every reason in the world to try to invest resources in creating a future that looks much better. We don't appear to be right on the precipice of going over some kind of a tipping point. By the same token, the carbon that we're emitting now will stay in the air for thousands of years, much of it. And so we're talking about investments we can make now to create a better future for 500 generations of our offspring down the road. But yes, definitely every ton of greenhouse gas emissions that we don't produce is valuable. It produces benefits to us in the future. And we don't know where those tipping points are for sure. But the best climate scientists that I talk to don't suggest that we have already passed some point of no return, basically.
All right, so that's good news. The other question is, okay, let's say we in the United States, we do all this stuff and we pass with flying colors, but then you got China over here or some other country and they aren't doing their part. And meanwhile, their economy is growing and that kind of thing. They're not handcuffing themselves with economic growth. What about that? What about China? What about some of these other players? Are you optimistic they will change, or what if they don't?
So they already are changing. So let's just first acknowledge that you've identified an incredibly important problem. Maybe the most important problem we all face on climate change is that we have a group of countries and any one of them has an incentive to defect from this cooperation that we all need on some level. And China, during the time I've worked on climate change, has gone from the number 2 emitter to the number 1. They passed us in the mid to late 2000s. So they're the number 1 emitter in the world. We're number 1 in terms of the total amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere that we've released over time. But China's number 1 by quite a bit in terms of what they emit every year. And India is growing very rapidly as well. Now, that's not true on a per person basis. That's true on a per country basis. But no doubt in the world, China and India need to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. But I'm optimistic that that is already happening and it's increasing. China is the largest manufacturer of solar powers in the world. It's a major player in electric vehicles. So yes, it has grown its economy through a high greenhouse gas strategy over the last several decades, but they're starting to change. They're starting to make commitments to reduce their carbon in ways that they would not make a decade ago. And India is starting to move in the same direction. And the other reason I think to be optimistic on this is that there are global networks now of financial and contractual pressure that are pushing down, even if the governments don't do what they want to. 40% of the 400 largest companies in the world have committed to go net zero. and many of them do business around the world. Walmart has committed to 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030, and it has roughly 60,000 suppliers around the world. So when it makes those kind of commitments and says we're going to get our suppliers to reduce their emissions, those are private networks of contracts around the world that are causing the manufacturers in those countries, even if the government hasn't done enough, to begin looking for ways to reduce emissions. So I think some combination of these larger countries like China and India beginning to make good commitments, plus the pressure from the global marketplace, is not going to get us where we need to be fast enough, but it's moving us definitely in the right direction.
Well, and that's great to hear too, pressure in the global marketplace. So we are seeing some of these big companies, and you mentioned that earlier, stepping up and I guess working on this. So then the other question I have would be the oil and gas industry. That's certainly a powerful lobby. Where do you see them in all of this? In the beginning, they were pushing back very hard. Are they still pushing back as hard? Are they trying to adapt, or will they continue fighting tooth and nail? Where is the oil and gas industry?
I think it's not a unified industry at this point. Unfortunately, I think there's a divide between the European-owned companies like Royal Dutch Shell, for example, and British Petroleum, and the American companies. And the European companies are ahead of the American companies right now in the commitments they're willing to make. I think last week was kind of a watershed moment for the oil industry, though. ExxonMobil lost a bid to try to prevent 2 members of its board of directors from getting elected who are motivated to reduce ExxonMobil's carbon emissions. So a hedge fund called Engine Number One was backed by major investors like BlackRock and others, and they got 2 members of ExxonMobil's board of directors elected who will be pushing them in the direction of trying to reduce their carbon emissions. Similarly, Chevron opposed a proposal by its shareholders, but 61% of its shareholders voted for a proposal to reduce the carbon emissions from the petroleum that Chevron sells, and that's called Scope 3 emissions. So you see, again, this kind of shareholder pressure pushing on the industry from a financial perspective. In other words, you want to be in an industry where even if we get to where we need to go on the climate front, you can still be making money. And I think what you're seeing is investors with a long-term horizon pushing on particularly the U.S. oil industry, but also the foreign oil industries. The other thing you're seeing that's very important is litigation that's out there that's creating some risk. And so, for example, again last week, a Dutch court ordered Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030. And that's from the oil it sells, not just from its refineries and its tankers operations, but literally 45% from the oil that it sells. Now, that decision may get reversed. It'll be appealed to the Netherlands Supreme Court, but it shows you the kind of risks. If you're an investor or a manager, an employee, a customer, you're wondering what's going to happen with this kind of litigation. An Australian court just in the last several days found that the Australian Environment Minister has a duty of care to young people in relation to a coal mine as well. And then there is litigation underway about consumer protection issues and concealment of environmental impacts. We don't know how any of that litigation will go in the United States, but it all creates an environment in which there is some legal risk out there, there is investor pressure out there, and then there's the risk of government actually following through on the kind of commitments that you open the program with. If the Biden administration follows through on its commitments to ramp up electric vehicles, to produce clean energy for the electricity supply, you're going to see further pressure on the demand for the products of that oil and gas industry. So I think that's the environment we're in right now. I think of all the industries, oil and gas and coal are the ones that are under the most pressure right now. And we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years, but my prediction would be ultimately they will all be on board, and it will be because of some combination of the swinging pendulum of government pressure with a much more consistent pressure from investors and lenders and customers and employees and things like that.
Let's say we reach the goal of 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. Let's say the political will stays there. We actually hit that goal. What does our life look like Does it mean we're all driving electric cars? Does it mean we all have solar panels on our homes? Does it mean half of us do? What does our life look like in 2035 if we meet that goal?
Okay, meeting that goal will actually be almost invisible to most people. And we're heading close to that goal as it is in much of the country right now. And why is that true? Well, because we are producing much more solar power than we used to, much more wind power. We've replaced most of the coal-fired power plants, and that process will continue. We'll see natural gas, and the big question will be, how long will natural gas be a viable source of electricity as well? But I think you'll see surprisingly little difference. There will be some solar panels on homes and so forth, but most of the electric power will be generated by large, very efficient wind and solar, hydro, some nuclear, certainly here in the valley, sources of electricity, and that will be almost invisible to most users of electricity. The other big things that we're going to see, though, I think are just fascinating. We're going to see a decarbonized electric grid, like you mentioned. We're going to see electric vehicles, and let me just give you, if I can, some of the numbers about what automakers are predicting about where we'll be. If we're going to be fully decarbonized, we're going to have almost all electric vehicles by 2035. And that's not just a law professor spouting. Let me just give you some examples of numbers I just recently heard. Ford Motor Company is predicting it will sell 40% electric vehicles by 2030 alone. As you might have seen, it just released an electric Ford F-150 pickup truck as well. General Motors has said it sees an all-electric future, as it called it. Honda Motor Company is expecting 40% electric vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Hyundai is expecting 100% electric vehicles by 2040. I could go on, but you see what's going on. These automakers have made these commitments. These are long-term investments in their workforce, in the equipment to make the vehicles. So you can have a change of control of Congress, you can have a swinging pendulum on the White House, but these are trends that are in place. Subaru says they're going to have 40% electric vehicles by 2030. Volkswagen says 40% by 2030. And by the way, one of the good things for our region is that we're probably the leading manufacturer of electric vehicles and electric batteries and other parts in the Southeast. So our area is very well positioned to prosper in a time when you see this kind of uptake of electric vehicles.
Hearing you gives me real hope and optimism. And I'm really happy to hear that. In a moment, we'll start taking calls, and I don't know what that'll do. But I mean, when I turn on the news, I feel like it's this iceberg has broken free, and it's 103 up in North Dakota today, and that's a record-shattering temperature. I don't have that optimism, but when I hear you talking, I'm getting some optimism. So where are we really, do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of both, no question. So no matter, even given my optimism, we will have some very serious problems with climate change in the future. We're going to have much more serious heat waves. We're already seeing that. We're going to have sea level rise. We're going to have migrations of people as a result of the sea level rise. We're going to see changes in the productivity of agriculture. Those effects are baked into the system. But, we have adapted to problems in the past. What we can't adapt to is the severity of the climate change that will continue in the future if we don't go in the direction we're going. But in the last decade, have become much more optimistic, in large part because I'm seeing the private sector pushing government rather than the other way around. And I did not see that 20 years ago. I have a book called Beyond Politics, the Private Governance Response to Climate Change. And that book was the product with physicist Jonathan Gilligan on the Vandy faculty of our looking around and seeing so much movement on the private sector. So I'm really pleased about that. I sometimes, to my students, show a slide which has on the one side a picture of a streetscape in New York City in Easter 1900, and it's all horses. And then the same area in 2013 on Easter, and it's all automobiles. And to me, that's just a great example of how that was a 13-year period. We made this absolutely remarkable transition. I think we're in the same period now. We are going to transition from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. We're going to electrify buildings. We're going to decarbonize the grid. Will it be all successful? Will we get there 100%? No, I don't think so. But we don't have to be 100% successful. But what I see that's totally different from a decade ago is remarkable movement baked into the investments and the trends globally that I just didn't see before.
That's fascinating. And even if the political will wavers, there is this kind of investor pressure that is moving the ball. All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll start taking calls. So there are a couple people on the lines. Bruce, others, hold on. And if you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. So we'll take a break. Be back right after this.